Like, what were you doing? What were some of the things that you've done in the past?
Yeah, cool. But before I answer that, I want to ask, did you, on your journey, have any mentors when you started?
Sure. Yeah, for sure. So I've been very entrepreneurial from day one, really. I used to, when I was 14 years old, I used to jump the fence at my parents' property and go over to the Dunes golf course. Yeah. And I would go and steal the golfers' balls, wash them and sell them back to them. I bought my first ever CD, my first album doing that. That was my first system.
Yeah, great.
But no, then I ran my own business when I was 22 as a tradesman for a few years. But then my real first crack at being an entrepreneur, like a proper business, I guess, was at VentureFit, which was we spoke briefly earlier, the travel company. So I'd take people on adventure holidays. And I had some really quality mentors early, and they all said, don't start this company, whatever you do. This is the hardest industry. It's a shit model, like blah, blah, blah. And I tend to agree with them after spending 5 years in the travel industry. But I have the world's best mentor in travel, really. He's a good friend of mine, Daryl Wade. He owns Intrepid Travel and Intrepid Group, and now Scalata Ventures, which is a VC fund for socially impactful companies, I guess. If you had have said to me, yeah, you get to pick one mentor, I mean, industry specific, like if you said you get to pick one mentor, I'd probably just be like, yo, Elon, fuck, what's happening? But he'd be like, what do you want me to help? Well, I can't help you. But if you had to, so we'd just be traveling to doing trips to Mars. But so I actually had Daryl as a mentor and a few other really great mentors, but Daryl was, he'd be my number one pick. If I had to redraft my mentors and in the travel industry, Daryl would probably be number one. So, and that was just through a bit of networking and, being a nice guy to the right people and, being genuine and whatever. People wanted to help. So why did you ask that?
Well, it's because you were saying before around kind of the key lessons, some of the things you hadn't learned at the start that you had to learn the hard way. I find mentors bridge that gap. And
100%.
Interesting segue. So you asked what I did prior to Cannabis. So in 2010, I got my first kind of real job, and by real job, out of hospitality. My background initially was in hospitality. My father owned restaurants, and his dad owned restaurants, etc. And after that, I started working in online marketing, and that's where I got my feet wet into tech and startups. And from 2010 to 2014, I played around with some startup concepts. However, when I moved to Sydney in 2012, I abandoned everything that I had in Melbourne. I didn't have any friends there, which was a blessing in disguise because I had myself and my ideas that I could work on. So from 2012 to 2014, I just built startups. And the startups that I built was inspired by my time traveling in India. I noted that there were a lot of kids with entrepreneurial talent that were just roaming the streets, scamming people for money and trying to make a buck.
Very entrepreneurial.
Amazing.
Similar to my golf ball story.
Yeah, there's something there. And my question was, what would happen if they had access to mentorship and the internet? So I started thinking about that, and I came home to Melbourne and built a website that connected people with questions to experts or mentors with answers via video chat. Cool. And this was really kind of video chat conversation technologies. And I built that out. Eventually, I got onto a program that was funded by ANZ. They had a accelerator called Innovise. I applied and successfully was approved, and I quit my job. And in 2014, I went full-time into startup land. And from there, I iterated and pivoted the concept from the initial, connect someone with a problem to an expert with an answer, to connecting startups to mentors, so that they could bypass certain challenges within the startup realm and hopefully succeed via, increased revenue, sales, capital raising, and so on. And then that evolved to a further step where we built a platform that a startup would come, they would take a test. It would evaluate the business out of a scoring rank of 100. And this was based on a scoring system that we had acquired from an American research institute. And from there, a company would get their score. And in the areas where they were lacking or where they needed improvement, we would connect them with a mentor that would specifically mentor them through the improvement process of that, in return for an equity share. So if I can help you achieve X, I take equity as my return, because mentors weren't, as I'm sure you know, encouraged by taking money from startups. They just wanted to help. But I felt help could be incentivized. And that was the business. And you said successful. It was successful in many respects. It was picked up by an accelerator. It had a number of staff members. We never successfully raised capital. However, I learned a few hard lessons in that experience, which is trust your intuition when it comes to humans. And at one point, I had a developer who was the co-founder, and at the 11th hour, we had a major tiff, and he walked. Well, I asked him to leave the business.
Yeah, right.
So I had to start from scratch, and doing that all again from scratch, I just burnt out. I lost my passion.
Yeah.
So it never took off.
It's hard, man.
Yeah.
Sounds like an interesting model. To the mentor thing that when you mentioned earlier, I think I get a lot of questions on advice for starting businesses and so forth now, not because I know what I'm doing, but because I have a podcast, I have social media following, like people know that I do business. And my previous business, although it made little to no money, the brand was awesome, the product was sick, it was very cool, I guess. So people, will come to me for advice. And two of the things I mentioned, and it's funny, I've been saying this since before my new company, Athena, but Athena is an outsourcing agency, so we take really talented freelancers from all around the world and plug them into small business, basically. So the two things I've always said to people is find a mentor, whether they be, free or paid, whatever it is. Find a mentor who believes in you, who you trust, who's good, and find yourself some cost-effective help, because your first employee as a small business, I believe, shouldn't really be, if you're really just getting off the ground, it shouldn't or doesn't need to be 50 grand per annum, So, and that's how I've done it anyway. So they're the two things that I've always recommended. And the mentor thing, I couldn't agree more. I think having most of what I think mentors do as well is just they give you accountability and they give you, validation to your own ideas. But you need that. Yeah, you so badly need that and then also they'll tweak little bits and pieces and say, hey, there's a huge gap here that you've missed in your, numbers or your or whatever, that stuff that you don't like doing. So I like the theory and the idea, but yeah, business is hard and you really got to get the right people beside you, don't you? And you can't really tell until you're in the trenches with them if it's going to be a relationship that's going to work or one that's going to potentially blow up, I guess.
Yeah, I was a kid. I didn't know much then. And I thought I was very much in the belief system that it would all work out.
Yeah.
It didn't really matter who you worked with as long as it just all came together. And over time you learn lessons. Trust your intuition, trust your gut, listen to people's advice, because I did have mentors that said this relationship's going to fail and I didn't believe it. So it's all well and good to have a mentor, but also trust that mentor, listen to them, and perhaps pay for them, because free advice is free. If you pay with peanuts, you get monkeys.
Yeah.
So that's why I built a system where it was incentivized through equity, because it meant that the mentor had something that incentivized their intention, and the startup would have a stake in the ground and say, if you can achieve this, you get X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting. I learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for the experience.